Okay, so my book is about Exodus to the Virtual World, how online fun is changing reality. Okay, before I get into the book, there's a couple of things I'd like to go over, which are the definitions. Fun is an integral way in the way humans learn and interact in an environment that is enjoyable. Play is a way to learn about scenarios and avoid dangers. Virtual worlds are a world that are fabricated and do not necessarily have to be digital. Migration is the traveling from one realm or place to another. Aversive motivation is a drive from danger. Appetitive motivation is basic human drive, such as sex and eating. Coactivation is a threat paired with a reward. Interration deals with the legal status of virtual worlds. It is the legal creation of new and special kinds of territory and policy dealing with virtual worlds/games. Fungineering is the use of psychology and game theory to create social environments layered with choice and pleasurable sensations due to survival. Some themes. So the author went over a couple of themes in the beginning introductory of his book, and he had a couple of good points, which are the 5 here. The first one was development of future technology. The second was human migration and its economic, social, and political policy effects. Economic theory of human time use and allocation of attention. Psychology of human happiness, specifically the sensation of vertigo people get while they're playing games. 5. The tools public policy uses to analyze questions of happiness. 4 predictions in the beginning of his book as well that he goes on to explain throughout the book. The first prediction is that time we spend on games and choices we make will feel like an exodus from our own reality. The effects will be seen as game design and policy designers do have similar activities. Games will create artificial realities. Politicians make rules, so do game developers. 3. Because they are similar, they will also be crossovers in know-hows. 4. Games are designed to make people happy. As mentioned in number 3, games will force fun into policies and agendas. Okay, since we went over some of the basic themes in the author's predictions, I'm going to go into a basic outline of the themes in each of the chapters that were written. The book was broken into 3 different sections of the book, which was migration, game policy, and real policy. So in chapter 1, he first started talking about a device called the holodeck, which was a part of the TV show Star Trek. It simulated a virtual world environment that was used for training and entertainment purposes. According to Moore's law, people pursue more pleasurable activities for as long as possible and less on those that they don't. Under Moore's concepts as well, why would the crew do anything other than the holodeck if it was so enjoyable? The holodeck was available to all and free of charge. These concepts set the stage for the introduction of online computer virtual worlds. In-game worlds also have working economies. These game economies are also transferable into real money, which kind of raises this whole intertwining of policy between games and real worlds. So the fun revolution is, as virtual worlds become more realistic, the real world will have to compete with people's use of time, thus the real world will need to become more fun to hold people's attentions. So intertwining back into that whole idea of economies, how they overlap, currencies from games are very hard to calculate in real world value. Such things like GDP. How do you figure out how much in-game wealth does it actually occur to in real life? Every minute someone wastes making money in games, it takes away from production in U.S. economy. Is that considered a loss of GDP? Declaring a separate online currency means that the IRS cannot claim taxes on any of the money that you're making in-game. Economic theory supports the idea that virtual worlds do not mean that they're valueless. Real-world money is virtual too. If you think about it, there is no true value to money. It's more of a utensil for trading. Another point that I want to raise up in this chapter is that games are not toys. They teach us a lot of different values, and they mimic a lot of things that you see in real society. So chapter 2 dealt with game societies. Digital games make learning more interactive. Instead of reading, one can play demos using these concepts.
The author argued that games can also reshape a childhood. Because games are more interactive, it might work better with different people's learning styles. Um, Dimitri Williams had stated that there are three basic structures to the video gaming industry, which was retailers, publishers, and developers. He also mentioned that those first two that I mentioned earlier, have been around for quite a long time now. But development is a very new field. The makers or the developers get reputations from their games rather than pedigrees. The differentiation between real and not. This is a pretty important topic for why video games are so effective. Um, okay, so basically, in video games, there are certain things that you can obviously tell are real and what aren't. But the human brain was wired to think that when you see a stimulus, you believe it's real until the more complicated parts of your brain tell you differently. So seeing a tiger on the TV, your basic instinct is, oh, that's a tiger. But then the front of your brain says, it's just on the television, so there's nothing really threatening about it. So newer technologies are starting to blend these two really a lot more together, making things feel a lot more realistic. Okay, so some of the things that make a game more realistic is that the human brain works on core drives and inner urges. A driver in making things real, which is pleasurable sensations known as vertigo, makes it harder for the brain to want to or be able to discredit media. So, going over adding the social ingredients to media. Before digital games, media consumption was mainly an individual affair. Even though people sat next to you while you watched TV, people cheering along to a game really didn't change the outcome of the experience. The same person won regardless if they screamed or not. New worlds are built to look like real worlds. They have similar elements such as economies, hierarchies, prestige, new dialogue, language, terrains, and other people. These are known as synthetic worlds. In all economies, demands drive what is created and how much is made. You can look kind of at they mentioned communist countries in the book. It was hard to see what people needed in economies. They mentioned that in Soviet Russia, more rubber boots were made than toilet paper. People get immersed inside in-game economies, working and trading things within a game. It doesn't leave the magic circle in a sense. It's impossible for some aspects of reality to portray things in games, though, however. In video games, characters are a lot more like actors. Video games are the preceders of devices like the holodeck that was mentioned in Chapter 1. Just because games are online, it doesn't mean that it's a massive multiplayer game. Not playing formally with others in groups, but rather like things like scoreboards. So if you've ever played a game where you can show your friends a score, it's not necessarily multiplayer, even though it is competitive. The author predicted all forms of games will eventually be digitalized. Okay, so going over some of the virtual worlds, the idea of avatars and dress up. People have diversity of interests, which affects the way that they play and express themselves in games. Some characters play different roles, such as healers and fighters in combat games. Um, People also dress their avatars based on a hierarchy. Another element that goes into games is touch. So this is something that all games have lacked, and that's something I see in the future games are going for. It's a driving force in almost all human experiences. You see things very basic in things like vibrating controllers or like a DDR dance pad. Another element to the future of gaming would be an emotive artificial intelligence. So games are trying to make characters more emotionally believable. Um, they add things like better voice chats, etc., to make the character feel more realistic. Another direction that people are taking games is taking very old stories like folklore or a movie made a long time ago and trying to revamp it into a new movie or into a new game. It's a very cost effective way to combat the expansive costs of game creation. Okay, the second part of the book deals with in-game policies. Since I've already covered most of the topics inside of Chapter 5, I'm just going to go jump right to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 deals with a theory of fun. It talks about a sensation of happiness, which is the satisfaction of reaching our goals. It releases endorphins inside of our body. So fun is a specific kind of learning in which happiness is used to learn survival techniques. So um, there are two basic motivation systems that the human body uses to complete tasks. The first is appetitive, which is is a drive for gene survival, which deals with resources, food, and sex. Aversive motivation deals with threats. So this is the basic fight or flight instinct. Coactivation is when you pair these two together um, for some kind of reward. Face the threat for reward. Psychology of happiness is a treadmill, meaning that once you get something you need, you aim higher and higher for something better. People are never satisfied with they eventually get, essentially. Experiences with threats also incite survivalist likelihood. So the main definition that I'm going to use for fun, once again, is a pleasurable activity that, when it's attributed to these four things, causes coactivation of motivational systems, activities related to survival, choices promote survival, situation is known to be play. That's the most important part of knowing about fun. Those that treat life as play seem to enjoy themselves more, essentially. Policy implications of design. Policy creates conditions in which people feel safe but also challenged and rewarded. Fun public policy is known as, in this book, they called it game design. Yeah, there we go. All right. Chapter 7 is a bulk of the material of in-game policy. Okay, so game designers have access to creating inequality of powers in games. A social order is created by the environment that the game creator makes. Game designers make rules much like government does. So the definition of fungineering. Fungineering is using psychology and game theory to create social environments layered with choice and pleasurable sensations due to survival, but safe coactivation motives. And it studies relations between societies, choices, and happiness. So, much like real policy, games have their own built-in synthetic government. The first of the 7 cabinets is the Ministry of Constitutional Affairs, which deals with development and execution of policy, laws, and regulation. It minimizes what the game attempts to do, then polishes. It also gets people to test the game and fix based on recommendations. Feedback is vital to evaluating rules. The main goal is to minimize the task of the government and execute perfect partnership with players. The second is Ministry of Interior. They deal with the concerns of the developers and the citizens. It gathers information from players. It is the government's ears and mouthpiece. The Ministry of Culture is responsible for the lore. It creates background significance, interactions, places, and stories. It's also responsible for maintaining aesthetic consistency and creates sound and visuals, which must be organic. The next section is the Ministry of War, which handles all fighting and combat. It introduces coactivation and a failure of state. Most basic systems are an exertion of power. Power is measured by experience points. Power is balanced by choosing different fighting classes. Power is also balanced by leveling and fighting in other tiers. Okay, so the next ministry is the Ministry of Economics. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It deals with the power of characters is dependent on the items that they own. Items are tiered. It's responsible for in-game gratification through monetary reward. Each new player, and it's important for the main idea of the economics in games to note that each new player starts off with the same opportunities and no advantage. They're all started on level 0, basically. So it deals with the money-making stats, so in the game, rather than the Ministry of War, which dealt with combat stats, Ministry of Economics deals with the money-making stats in the game. And it was also important for the Ministry of Economics to balance out all the stats, therefore you have an equal chance of making money no matter which choice you made within your career profession. So the Ministry of Social Affairs deals with interactions between players. It allows them to form guilds. By encouraging social interactions, more people will put more time and obligations into the game, thus playing longer. The last one is the Ministry of Justice, which deals with the behaviors that are not tolerated. Game masters or moderators punish people This is a system based on speed, but not necessarily justice. It deals with when people use exploits in the games, and yeah, that's basically what the social ministry or the Ministry of Justice does.
Part 3 is essentially what deals with the overlapping between modern policy and game policy. So there's some of the so the first thing to note about game policy is that there's no hidden agendas. Honestly, the only reason people make policy in games is to make experiences more fun. No one really profits off of policy in game. But there are some things that overlap in a lot of games and what is in modern policy, such as unemployment, equality of opportunity, quality of outcomes, an economy, uh, wages and corporate structures, economic growth, tax, inflation. Okay, so Chapter 9 dealt with the fun society. Here's some policy issues that were consistent between the two different groups of government and modern society, and video games. So the policy process is much more different because, like we said, one's focusing on fun while the other one is focusing on practicality. The scope of government is that in video games, government is virtually non existent, other than a moderator you see occasionally for someone breaking severe rules. Myths. Myths are that people share similar backstories and culture, etc. It also deals with how people generally start off with the same ideas, etc., versus how their culture is divided a lot more in modern society. Law is pretty self-explanatory. It's the rules that are provided. Um, because, like I said, the difference between play and practicality are different. That's the way that these two are separated as well. So in community, or iteration basically deals with the interlapping of the two policies, specifically how in-game trading, um, if you sell coins for real money, now that becomes a policy in the real world as well. So the community is also deals with how people communicate. In games, it's a lot more group oriented, and in the real world, it's a lot more self interest. So access also talks about how like when you start a game, you really have the same opportunities available to you as everyone around you. But in the real world, people usually get things like inheritance, which gives them a leg up over a lot of other people. Education, that kind of goes back into community, talking to people. But segregation, these are both two concepts that are in both the real world and games as well. Segregation in games, it's a lot less taboo because you're not really fighting over any physical space. That's not a problem in reality. Honestly, they'd honestly just start up a new server for people that disagreed on rules, which is a very simple solution, but the last cause. And the last one, national defense. The author also said that games are kind of an outlet for people to vent their aggravation. So, in that sense, games are a healthy alternative to conflict.
Last chapter of the book, Chapter 10, The Fun Revolution, Ending Politics of Misery. So in this last chapter, we talk mainly about how video games are becoming modern debates, and the biggest one is talking about how they're harmful to children. He suggests that digital games have not been fully understood, and we don't know how it affects people. The author mentioned a couple of things, how video games sort of act like mentors and can be substitutes to family care, which is kind of strange to me, but I understand where it's coming from. Because it essentially says that certain characters can teach us moral lessons. Some other big changes in the game. We need to understand that games are symbols. They're not actually real things. At the end of the day, you can kind of relate some of these symbols back to a dungeon and a dragon is interchangeable with real life aspects such as working in an office and the dragon is your boss. Now you're back in the real world essentially. The big question Castronova asks is what kind of social order would allow for the concepts of these games to cultivate in real life. We need to understand that the policies of fun work in contrast with business and making profits. He had also stated in human history, happiness or hedonism is something that people shouldn't pursue in life, which is basically a lot of the concepts in games, just pleasure. But also, it's important to note that no one on their deathbed will ever say, I wish I worked more. They talk about relationships, memories, successes, and failures. Essentially, we need to find a balance between the two. So, the last concept that's covered in the book is the resurrection of evil and good. A virtual world provides a second map of meaning to those in life and allows people who wish to live vicariously due to not being able to do such actions in real life. Good and evil is nothing more than abiding by a code believed by most of society. This is a moral gray area because some groups may just call each other evil. Morals can be considered subjective. A freedom fighter to one is a terrorist to another. In virtual worlds, it is easy to portray evil though through symbols such as monsters. Beyond the frustration and boredom and emptiness was the very last bullet that I am going to mention today, because this was how the guy summed up his story. Today, games just seem like distractions, but eventually they will grow into amusement, and amusements will turn into challenges. Then there will be a revolution in gaming. Only some practices of games cross over to real world, like the challenges of trying to find equality. Also things like less emphasis on wealth and more focus on values and happiness. If the aspects of games are properly implemented into real life, then the overall quality of the human experience will be increased as well. That is the end of my presentation. I hope